Chodesh Tov. It is the time that we increase in our joy. And I was reminded of a story that made me smile this week, and I wanted to share it with you. When I was in rabbinical school, I was always interested in what my professors were researching and writing about when they were not in class with us. I never really considered myself an academic, and admittedly, there were occasionally times that I was less than enthused about a particular course, but I always had great respect and reverence for my professors. And one year on my first day back on campus, I bumped into Dr. Barry Kogan, a familiar name here at Holy Blossom. And I greeted him and said, "Dr. Kogan, it's so good to see you. How was your summer?" And I'll never forget his response. "Hi, Zachary, it's good to see you. I spent much of my summer in the 13th century in Ontario's cottage country." What an incredible response. He was so deeply involved in his work, feeling so close to his subject that he was not exploring the history of the 13th century. He was not researching the scholars of the 13th century. No, Dr. Kogan spent the summer in the 13th century. He was fully immersed. I was reminded of this interaction this week as I had the privilege of spending much of my week in Israel, joined by some 50 Holy Blossom community members and friends of Holy Blossom. Each night this week, I was touring in Israel. We spent time in Haifa, speaking with leaders of different faith communities. We visited a world-class family-operated herb farm, went on a food tour in Levinsky Market, and sat in an authentic Bedouin tent in the high desert of the Negev in Israel South. It was really a special week, to say the least. And at the conclusion of our time together, we asked members who traveled, quote unquote, with us, what resonated? What about this tour made us feel so immersed in Israel? Pam Albert, the co-chair of the Israel Engagement Committee and the organizer of this wonderful tour, commented how each evening felt familiar, that she appreciated how much of the trip was focused on individual people and their stories. And as we continue to hear from more folks and more reflections, three major themes developed: belonging, peoplehood, and history. Now, the Zionist in me could not but help hear the words of Israel's hopeful national anthem, Hatikva, as a natural parallel of these sentiments: belonging, peoplehood, and history. The concluding lines of Hatikva read, "Lihiot am chofshi be'artzenu," to be a free people in our land. Now, it is worth noting that it is simply impossible to represent the complexities of the state of Israel in roughly 10 hours of programming. We did not dive into the multifaceted conversations of security, geopolitics, or religious pluralism. We did not address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or discuss Israel's upcoming fourth election in just 2 years. It's not that we glossed over or avoided any contentious topics. Rather, we engaged with Israel through the lens of what it means to be a free people living in our land. And in a way, this is the same framework that the Israelites are required to entertain in Parshat Mishpatim. Centuries before Hatikva was written, and even before our people inhabited the land, we had to ask, how do we build a just society? How do we ensure that all the people have freedom to live full, meaningful lives? This week's Torah portion offers some instructive advice, but perhaps it can be a bit paradoxical at times. The portion outlines the Jewish laws meant to create closure after an injustice has been committed. These laws are supposed to allow relationships to heal so that people are able to live together in harmony. There are two broad categories of laws presented in this portion, which break down how the Israelites related to the world around them: the laws regarding slavery and the laws regarding free peoples. And these laws create a structure for the relationship between the Israelites when one of them enslaves the other. They ensure that even when bound to servitude, an enslaved person still has the right to fair treatment. And of course, we know that there is no such thing as fair treatment when one human being owns another. We need to dive a little deeper here. It is also this section where we find the law of retaliation, commonly referred to as the law of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Many people believe that laws in this category are not meant to be interpreted literally. Rather, they point to the relationship between equals who deserve equal restitution when they have been wronged. These laws create a system that enables the Israelites to solve internal problems. And all of these mitzvot are outlined moments before Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Before the revelation of the law, the Israelites were a group of individuals bound together, but by their experiences of slavery in Egypt and a common ancestry, their experiences as outsiders. And it is through the reception of Torah at Sinai that they became bound as a collective people with a shared community, with a shared social contract. Only after receiving the Ten Commandments did they become a full-fledged society. In order for a new society to succeed, its members must agree to social codes about how to treat each other. But this ideal of mutual respect completely falls apart when one person enslaves another. There is always this question. If God could take the Israelites out of Egypt, why could not God also create a society without slavery? The Israelites themselves were enslaved in Egypt. Surely it would not have been a radical act of imagination for them to create a society in which all people were free. So we have to ask, how should we engage with this parsha, which includes both the foundational mitzvot on which our systems of justice stand, as well as laws of human slavery? A Midrash in Pasikta de Rav Kahana tells the story of a king who, when he married, told his new wife that she would have a beautiful home and everything that she ever wanted. And he recorded these promises in a large and beautiful ketubah. And sometime later, the king left for a distant land for many years. Others would come to the house and urge the now lonely woman to seek another spouse, and she always refused. When she felt lonely, she would go to her house and find comfort in reading from the ketubah. Eventually, the king returned, and when he found her waiting for him, he said, "I am amazed that you waited for me all of these years." She said to the king, "If it were not for this large and beautiful ketubah that you wrote for me, the others may have already convinced me to leave." This midrash then presents the story as a parable for Israel in exile. The king going away symbolizes that feeling that maybe God had abandoned us to suffer, with other nations attempting to lure us from our heritage. Yet we were gifted with a beautiful ketubah, our Torah. The Midrash ends with a verse from the Psalms, "Were not your Torah my delight, then I would be lost in my affliction." We learn from this verse that our tradition of engaging with the study of Torah can help us find a path when we are lost. We are provided with a constant connection to the wisdom passed down from generation to generation. As we look to our narrative at this point in the book of Exodus, Israel should be at a spiritual high point, having been graced with redemption and witnessing the splitting of the Red Sea. Additionally, we have this theatrical and incredible revelation of the Ten Commandments being given as Israel is immersed in God's thundering presence. These stories provide a loving description of God's covenant with Israel, And considering the Midrash from Pasikta Rav Kahana, these are the stories that warrant our attention when seeking inspiration and guidance in times of challenge and distress. And then we are confronted with Parshat Mishpatim, which begins with the ethics of slavery. It's mind-boggling and painful to see these laws written into the narrative so soon after Israel itself had been redeemed from captivity. It seems so contradictory that the Torah would allow the practice of human bondage after condemning Pharaoh and Egypt for their treatment of Israel. This acute discomfort makes Mishpatim a difficult portion to consider. Seeing the approval of forced servitude in the text may disenchant us from the power of God and the sense of justice and redemption that has been experienced in previous stories in Exodus. It may even cause us to question the moral grounding of Torah. So how do we reconcile this conflict? Is there something to be learned from this passage that might foster the feeling of love and support, like the ketubah from the Midrash? Biblical scholar Dr. Robert Alter recognizes this tension, stating, "The Bible does not question this institution of slavery, but sets certain limits on it. As one can see in the subsequent laws, the slave does retain basic human rights. Mishpatim sets up a system of indentured servitude where individuals are not actually owned as personal property. Other basic rights are highlighted by the fact that people can only be kept in this system for so long, for a certain amount of time before being set free, and that no individual shall ever have harm done to them physically. And when we look at the laws that follow, we continue to see that the Torah strives to create a covenant that appreciates the sanctity of human life. In Exodus 22, we read that we are not to treat strangers unkindly, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. The Talmud notes that this commandment is given 36 times, highlighting the importance of remembering our suffering in order to treat others justly. This is where we find our guidance in Mishpatim. It is difficult to learn from a passage that condones slavery after what happened in our history. Let us be clear. Slavery, no matter where and when it has or continues to take place, is completely abhorrent and can never be justified under any circumstances whatsoever. And on the surface, these laws address slavery and indentured servitude, but at their core, we aim to emphasize that we are all B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God. This is the core of what Abraham Joshua Heschel calls depth theology, that all humanity is deserving of the highest dignity and utmost respect, for we are all of the same source of being. Yes, Israel had slaves at the time that the biblical text was written, and the law sought to keep Israel from treating their slaves as Egypt did. In essence, the law would prevent our ancestors from turning into those who had so cruelly and heartlessly oppressed them. Spending this week in Israel gives deeper meaning to this truth as well. We heard so many stories representing at least a dozen ethnic and religious backgrounds. I recognize that Israel today is a modern nation. It does have issues, it does have systemic issues. It is far from perfect. Though the Israel that I love elevates and holds as holy the life and story of each individual. It is the reason why we focused on people and stories rather than history and politics. As with the lonely wife in the Midrash, it would be easy for us to be judgmental, to view Mishpatim as archaic or irrelevant because of some of its subject matter. However, when we look to its deeper meaning, we see the law engaging in the sacred process of striving to build a better world. We shall not be turned off or look for other paths, as others have tried to coerce this lonely wife in our midrash. We must remember to look at Torah not only as an agreement, but also as our ketubah, a source of guidance and comfort and love. Shabbat shalom.